Okay, we might have a few people joining us a bit later, but I wonder now whether we should make a start. So I'm just going to hand over to our chair, Edna Robinson.
I think I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Great to have you here. And on this actually quite sunny day today here in Manchester, where I am. So hope it's sunny where you guys are too. So it's a great opportunity for us this morning to get together, and as the People's Powerhouse, we're really pleased to be partnering today with More in Common, and thank you very much for that suggestion. And as always, when there's an opportunity to partner and grow our strength and widen our voice and build our connections, we're in there. So thank you for that. We were never going to turn that down. So thanks. So special welcome to Tim and Arissa, who I know are our main authors for today. And as you can see from the screen, I'm not Johnny Ross Tatum, I'm actually Edna Robinson, and Johnny's just joined us actually. So I must get my tech sorted later on today. But that's a hangover from our convention, our very successful convention a couple of weeks ago, where my team took over all the IT, which was very sensible, so that we were none of us individually in control. But anyway, thanks again. And obviously this is a launch of the report, and that's been coming since October, when the Common Ground and Division exploration was launched. And so clearly from that, there's a huge amount of learning and a huge amount of insight about which will help us in the People's Powerhouse to frame our work in the coming year also. So you know, really looking forward to hearing more about that. And just a word about us, we are the People's Powerhouse in the North, and we were launched on the back of an anxiety about the lack of diversity within the Northern Powerhouse business framework. And that was 4 years ago now. And there was a sense that there weren't enough voices of complexity, voices of difference, voices of different perspectives in the room, or even in the conversation when devolution was talked about. And as we know, the UK is still one of the most centralized countries in the world in terms of devolution of power and constructs. So we felt that we didn't want to see a narrow bunch of blokes in a room still being the people who would actually make the decisions about the future of the shape of the North. And so we were built on the back of just some positive energy saying we can do this differently and we will do this differently. And so 4 years on, we're going strong, and we have our annual convention, and we've just had our last one, which physically should have been in Blackpool, but of course it was virtual. It was still a fantastic success. We had hundreds and hundreds of people. We had loads of different perspectives and arts and music, poetry, as well as all the heavy political stuff. So a really lovely mix. And I hope if many of you weren't there, you'll be able to join us next year in Blackpool, when hopefully we get into that ballroom and I can get my big frock on. So we are seriously excited about getting back to normal, aren't we, all of us, in a year's time. So thanks again. I'm going to pass over now to Tim, and he's actually going to take us through the next step. So well done for this piece of work. Thank you for sharing it with us, and thanks for being a partner. And I really look forward to us working together in the coming year. So thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Edna, and thank you on behalf of Arissa and myself. What I'll do is just say a little bit of introductory things, and then what we'd like everybody to do is to jump online and answer a short number of questions which are related to the conversation that we're having about the Britain's Choice study today. So just a couple of introductory things. We are going to record the video, and so that it can go online and be shared with people who are unable to make it. So if you'd rather not have your noggins on the video, then you can turn that off. If you want to ask any questions as we go, just put that into the chat function. We will have a little bit of time towards the end to answer questions, but we'll also, Arisa is going to be monitoring it as we go. And so if there's questions just to sort of understand something, or maybe a more detailed question about the survey, then Arisa could also answer that in the chat function. So otherwise, just remember to keep yourself on mute, all the sort of rules of the road that we're familiar with. What we'd like to do is I'll sort of start sharing in a moment, but just to explain a little bit about our work, and my apologies that I have a strange backdrop because I am literally standing. I've just moved house. I'm halfway between Leeds and Manchester, and I haven't got any furniture besides a few boxes. So I'm sort of standing in front of a set of boxes, and it looks a lot more sensible to you than it does to me. But what we're going to do is I'll show you just the outline of where we are going. We are going to talk about the More in Common's work just very quickly, just so you have the sense of the context of why we do what we do. We're going to take you through what we call the British Seven. This is the 7 different types of people that we've found in our research. Then we're going to look at the insights from this new report that we've done on community and on society and regional differences. And what we're looking for there is insights that may be of practical application, provide insight to the work that you're doing, and look for the findings around the shared sense of pride, the shared sense of priorities that cross these groups. So our point when we're doing our work at More in Common is very much to understand people's differences and understand what makes them tick, and their values and their beliefs and their aspirations for the future, but not with a view to dividing people up into different groups, but with a view to understanding how we build commonality, how we build common ground. A little background on our work. We have one part of our work, it's sort of, I guess, about a third, maybe a little bit more than that, is just a sort of a research function where we're in 4 different countries, in the UK, US, France, and Germany. And our origins are that in that period of about 4 or 5 years ago, similar to actually the timing for People's Powerhouse formation, we were seeing just the acceleration of these forces of division driving societies apart. The co-founders of More in Common, we were all friends of Joe Cox, MP for Batley and Spen. And particularly after Joe's tragic murder, we just felt that we had to do something about not just the sort of forces of extremism, but these larger forces that are sort of fragmenting and fracturing our societies. And the phenomena that are driving those divisions are not unique to the United Kingdom. They're in Western countries. In fact, they're beyond Western countries as well. And there's a lot of people who've more recently been writing and thinking about these. And we do that work from the lens of understanding both what's the unique story that people have in their community, in their region, in their country, but also what are these larger forces like the transformation of social media, for example, media environment, the breakdown of neighborliness and community, the rise of insecure work and the gig economy, and people's anxiety about the pace of change around them. And we do a lot of work to understand how people are experiencing all those changes, and then also to identify creative, innovative ways to build community, to build a sense of common ground, and to avoid division and the sort of descent into a polarized society. We brought out the Britain's Choice report just a few weeks ago. We have a website for that, which is just www.britain'schoice.uk. You can download an executive summary, you can download the full report, and as of next week, you can even watch a video that tells the story of the 7 segments of the population. And there's a little bit of the media coverage. We've already done quite a lot of presentations in different places to political leaders, to media, to community organisations, and for the next several months we think that there's some fresh things that have come out of this very large study that involves more than 10,000 people, conversations and focus groups with more than 140 people, one-on-one and in groups, and 4 waves of research that started before COVID in February, ran right up to September. So it's a very big project. There's been about 6 of us on the project team throughout this year, and our aim is to get a different take and to understand what's changed, particularly the COVID experience, but also what's enduring about the COVID experience, what's going to last beyond the other side of the vaccine that we're also desperately looking forward to. So what we're going to start with is to ask you to do something, which is to undertake a quiz that is the basis of how we build the story of these 7 segments of the population. And the trick here is that we don't ask a whole lot of questions. When we build a model to understand the differences among people, we ask the long-term questions about people's beliefs, aspirations, the way they see the world, their underlying values. And we work very closely with social psychologists, several countries, to build this model. And what we've found is it's incredibly insightful and practical in how it predicts where people stand on lots of the issues that are dividing societies. But I'll hand it over to Arisa to explain from here.
Great, thank you, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today. Tim, you could just go to the next slide, which has the instructions. So, yeah, as Tim said, it'd be great. We thought it'd be a good idea to just start off with a little activity and just to get a sense of who we're speaking to today, and thought it'd be interesting to find out where you all belong. So if you wouldn't mind following the steps on this slide, the first is to go to britain'schoice.uk/the-quiz. I will also paste the details in the chat. The quiz should only take about 5 minutes. But then once you do that, if you could then progress to the second step, which is to go to menti.com and use the code on the slide, and then just tell us which segment that the quiz says you belong to. Any problems, please do just shout in the chat or please do just shout or write in the chat. And just to add that if some of the questions in the quiz seem a little bit hard, please just try to answer to the best that you can and what you instinctively feel you lean towards. We know that some of them require some balancing or some nuance, but we're just interested in which way you lean. So I will give you a few minutes all to do that, and then hopefully we can introduce the groups to you. That's great. I can see a few answers coming through. I will give you all a few more minutes. If there's any issues, please do shout. All right, well, I'll leave it there. If anyone is still just finishing the quiz or wants to, please do just tell me in the next minute or so, then I can wait. But Tim, if you just stop sharing your screen, I can show you I can share mine. So as you can see, from all the people that have done the quiz so far, we all seem to belong to one particular group, which are the progressive activists. For those that didn't get the chance to do the quiz, it's just on our website on the link that I shared. So if you are interested to do it later, then please do go and do it. But I will, Tim, if you could share back your screen, then I can start to present the segments and we can get a better idea of who they all are. But that's very interesting. That we're all progressive activists. Sorry. Are you able to share your screen, Tim? Great. Well, thanks all for doing that. I hope it was fun. So this is an overview of all of our segments, and as you might have guessed by now, in the UK we've identified 7 groups which we think best describe the makeup of the British population and who we're calling the British 7. And as you can see, most of us, well, all of us here that did the quiz are concentrated in 13% in that top group. And then just to explain a little bit about how the segments were created. So they were created entirely from questions around values based on our core beliefs model, which draws from various aspects of social psychology. And it's important to note that no demographic information is used for the segmentation, or the groups do tend to naturally have different demographic characteristics. So our first group are the progressive activists. And they're a group for whom politics is at the very core of their identity. They're cosmopolitan, they're opinionated and critical, and often have the strongest views on many of the questions. They're the kind of people who I would identify themselves as activists, being frustrated with many of the injustices that they see in the world and wanting to correct for them. They're also very active on social media and often have the highest consumption of many different types of media, but they aspire readership of The Guardian. Our next segment are the civic pragmatists, and they share a lot of the same values as progressive activists, but they're not as oriented towards politics, and they're definitely not activists in the way that they approach the issues that they care about. Their focus is more on the communities and the people around them, and one of their most defining features is that 94% of this group say that they donate to charity regularly, which is almost twice the national average. They're also a group that dislike conflict and would much prefer to compromise. And they're quite a caring group. But another thing that really distinguishes them from the progressive activists is that they're a much more concerned and worried group, and they're much more likely, for example, to think that the world is becoming a more and more dangerous place. Our next segment are the disengaged battlers, and they're one of our more insecure groups, and they just feel like they're getting by, and they feel the system is unfair and often feel overlooked, but they don't blame other people for it. In fact, they just blame the system itself. They also tend to have quite socially liberal views. And as the name might suggest, they are more disengaged from society and politics in general than most other groups. Large numbers say that they have no interest in the news whatsoever, and they're the least likely group to vote, and then the most likely group to feel lonely. We then come on to a very different group. So these are the established liberals, and they're actually one of our most financially comfortable groups. their main features are that they're very content with life, which is in major contrast to our previous group as disengaged battlers. And as this quote from Michael, one of the people that we spoke to, shows, when established liberals look at Britain and in fact like the world, they just see a lot of good in it. And that's probably comes from the fact that they feel that the system works and they feel that they have a say in it. They feel that they have a say in politics. They're also a group that feel the safest, so that the least likely groups to feel that the world is becoming a more and more dangerous place. And they're also less likely to feel that their place in society is threatened. Our next group are the loyal nationals, who are again quite different to the established liberals in that respect, in that they are a very anxious group, and they're very anxious about the threats that are facing Britain and that are facing themselves. They're very proud and patriotic, but also feel that our society is becoming really unfair. And they're very frustrated about the gap that they perceive is happening between the haves and the have-nots. And I think this quote from George is really powerful. He says that he doesn't think the likes of himself matter anymore, and he goes on to explain why. And the sense that other groups are being favoured over them is really common among loyal nationals. Loyal nationals also have a relatively high consumption of news, so they're quite active on social media, especially more than other groups, and they have a higher than average readership of the Daily Mail. We then come on to the second of our disengaged groups. These are the disengaged traditionalists, and they make up 18% of the population, and that makes them the largest group that we have. They're a tough-minded group who really value a well-ordered society and strong leadership. And they're a similar group to the loyal nationals. So when you look at them, you kind of, if you looked at their demographics and their attitudes, especially towards things like immigration and immigrants, you'd think they were quite similar. But what really differs them is their attitudes towards responsibility in society. So while loyal nationals are really conscious of kind of group identity and feel really threatened and aggrieved as a group, disengaged traditionalists view things more in terms of the individual, which is why this quote from Jake is really telling of the group. So he says, "I'm a great believer of don't help someone until you've helped yourself." And that really speaks to the values that disengaged traditionalists hold in terms of being self-reliant and the pride that they take in hard work. Another interesting thing is that they really dislike this culture of handouts, which you can probably tell from what I've been saying, but this is also seen in an interesting fact in that they have the coldest feelings towards people who are on benefits. And understanding that nuance explains why disengaged traditionalists wouldn't be as concerned between the gap between rich and poor in the same way as loyal nationals, as they're much more likely to put onus on the individual. And our seventh and final group are the backbone conservatives. And this group are a comfortable group. They're proud and they're very optimistic about Britain's future outside of Europe. They're quite engaged with the news, but mostly via traditional media sources. They're also a nostalgic and patriotic group, being the group that are most proud of our cultural heritage and monarchy. And I really like this quote from Michelle, which really expresses her British pride in that she would always hang her British flags out if she could. So that's an overview of all the segments. I will pass back over to Tim, unless there's any questions that anyone wants to ask now. But I'll also be looking at the chat.
Okay, I'll jump in. So the main thing to say about the distribution of these segments of the population in the north is that it's pretty similar to the rest of the country. Now, for here, don't worry about the percentages here, because this is just telling you percentages of people in the north. And when you're kind of comparing, you've got larger numbers in Northwest and Yorkshire and the Humber. So the numbers aren't the point, but it's just that it's more the distribution by the colours of the segments. And when we've sort of looked into this to look at the breakdown in the north, the main thing is to say there are fewer established liberals, a little fewer backbone conservatives in the north, and there's a slightly larger number of disengaged traditionalists and loyal nationals. But the differences we're talking about are more like, rather than 17% of the population, it's like 20% or 21% of the population. So the message is more about similarity than it is about difference between the north and the rest of the country in terms of people. And that's not because the data isn't sophisticated enough to pick up on difference. So just as an interesting reflection, for the disengaged battlers, which is a sort of urban working class group, effectively, there's only half as many people in Cornwall in that group as in the rest of the country. And that sort of makes sense, because Cornwall doesn't really, didn't have a kind of a traditional urban working class base, mining and agriculture essentially. So we do see regional differences in our map, and with 10,000 people, you get a good spread across the country. But the point is, there is actually more similarity than there is difference. But there are some differences, as we say, just in terms of composition. So what I'm going to do now is to share some insights, firstly about community, and then we're going to look at the way in which people are experiencing their sort of sense of agency, and look at what that means for the sort of work that everybody does. Here's a good example of a disengaged traditionalist view. The human response to COVID-19 has been quite overwhelming. That real sense of community that I think we'd lost up until now, I just desperately hope there's elements of that we can hold on to. And that's a sentiment that we've heard across the north throughout this year. You'll see that there are some differences particularly in the northeast versus Yorkshire and the Humber, who are probably at the sort of, not opposite ends of the spectrum, but just so different levels of experience of community in the impact of COVID. But let's just look at some examples. So the question of how people feel represented in today's politics. Here, it's an overwhelming feeling in the country, 83%, who feel that politicians don't care about what people like me think. And the proportions are slightly higher in the north than in other parts of the country. So 89%, sorry, just slightly lower than the rest of the country. But that sense is 9 out of 10 people. It's a very strongly held view, a sense of disappointment, and just politics is not representing them. On the other hand, in terms of our feeling about each other, our experience of community, what we saw was a really interesting shift. We asked this question before the onset of the pandemic. Are we a society that cares for each other, or is it an everyone for themselves society? And the overwhelming feeling, 56 to 24, was, this is an everyone for themselves society. In May, in the weeks after the initial lockdown, there was all that surge of sort of solidarity and mutual aid. There's a really remarkable shift. And I think this is quite amazing to see in such a short space of time, that people saw their society differently. By 62 to 25% feeling that we're a society that looks after each other. That didn't last at that level of solidarity. And as we know, there was the Dominic Cummings incident. There was, a sort of a sense of frustration with various different government failings in response to the pandemic. But the point that's important is we didn't go back to where we were before the pandemic. And this is only a few weeks ago in September when we asked the same question. And we found that a majority now, and twice as many as before the pandemic, feel that we are a society that look after each other. There is something, and that's the sentiment that we saw in that quote, the sentiment that there is something good that's happened in terms of people's response, and they're looking after each other, even if some of that, the high of that feeling has come off since earlier this year. When we look at the breakdown within the north, and so we've got the split between the northeast, northwest, and Yorkshire and the Humber, and you can see that sense of we look after each other is stronger in Yorkshire, and it's the shift that we saw during the pandemic period was most dramatic in the northwest. But where the northeast and northwest now stand is actually exactly the national average, slightly higher, Yorkshire and the Humber. We asked a question about whether the pandemic has shown us that people in our country care about each other. And here you see 64% of people in the UK say that's the case. What's interesting here is that's higher than any of the other countries we surveyed. So we did a survey of 14,000 people across 7 countries. And the UK actually comes out stronger on the measures of community and solidarity and the way that people have responded to the crisis, which I think is, it's quite a different issue about how the government's responded, what the strengths and weaknesses of that. But this sense of the community has come together is stronger on our relative measures. And you can see that the numbers aren't quite as strong in the north as overall in the country. Particularly in the northeast, you see a lower number there, 52%. So that's 12 points below the national. The pandemic has made me more aware of the living conditions of other people in the country. One thing to note on the left here is that there's been the greatest the highest numbers there, the highest numbers of people saying that they feel different is among the disengaged groups, the disengaged battlers and disengaged traditionalists. That's actually a really good thing, because those are the people who tend to have lowest trust in each other, lowest trust in society, who tend to experience circumstances around them more negatively than other people. They've actually been the groups that we've seen the most positive shifts in. So this is not just a story that the pandemic has seen, you know, middle class, more prosperous people coming together with their more organized Facebook or WhatsApp groups, etc. There is evidence here that there is real sense of solidarity. And it's important to say that that is not a universal experience, of course, and there's many of you will have the experience of something else. But in terms of the overall numbers, that I think is a positive sign. You can see, however, that the Northeast shows a lower sense of becoming more aware of the living conditions of others, possibly there just because they already are aware of other people's living conditions in the Northeast. I'm part of a community. This is a question of like people feeling that there are others who understand, care for, and help them. And here again, what's interesting is a shift. That in the overall numbers, 57% of people now feel that they are part of a community. And the biggest shifts that we've seen are among the disengaged battlers, the loyal nationals, and the backbone conservatives. And then again, you see significant shifts there. The biggest positive shift there is in the Northeast, going from 44 to 55%. Now we're going through these very quickly, so obviously you can get the slides. I think Stephanie's going to distribute the slides, so you can sort of dig into these if it's of interest for the specific regional dimension. That we also asked a question about agency and sense of community power. So do you feel that people around your area are able to improve things when they want to? And you can see that there's been a really significant shift overall in the country. Now 2/3 of us feel that we can improve things around our own community. And that's really different from the story that people are saying about how they feel about the country. And 9 out of 10 saying they don't think politicians represent them, don't feel represented. And yet at that local level, people have more of a sense of participation, democracy, being able to change things. And what's particularly positive, I think, here is that disengaged battler group, which is the one that's, you know, struggling to keep their head above water often, and just so dealing with so much in their own lives that they have a lot less capacity to engage with the community around them and to volunteer and all of those things. They've actually had the biggest increase from 30 to 53% in their sense of being able to make a difference, or people in their community be able to make a difference. So that's a really positive shift. And again, you can see the numbers there, the same trends in all across the north. The largest increase in Yorkshire and the Humber, where you've got 65% of people saying that they feel they can improve things if they want to. Another question that we've asked is around change. And this is interesting to see that in the UK, there is more of an appetite to make important changes to the country than in any other of our major Western countries that we tested. Now, the sentiment of that, because we've had conversations with people and focus groups about it, it's not like we want to, you know, turn all the structures upside down. It's much more of a sense of there are things that are broken. And there's things that are broken that have been revealed, like the way that people work hard and just don't get rewarded. You know, only 13% of the country feels that hardworking people are given an adequate share of national wealth. So there really is the sense of there are things that are wrong, need to be fixed. And that sentiment is stronger in the UK than in other countries. And if we look at that breakdown in terms of individual parts of the country, the sentiment here in the north is very similar to the rest of the country. It's just it's actually not higher. It's a couple of points lower, but you can see there that it's across all segments of the population. Slightly lower level of enthusiasm for change among disengaged traditionalists, backbone conservatives, but even the backbone conservatives, you know, which is a group that has a very strong political affiliation to conservatives, 82% of them vote conservative in the election. They still feel like this is a time for significant change. They're, you know, even though they are nostalgic, very conservative in their values, they also see that this is a time for change. If we look at in terms of regional issues and regional differences, here's one statement from Daniel in the Northwest. The choices they're making down in London are affecting people nationally and globally as well, and they don't seem to care. They seem to be all about them, all about their party, all about what's best for them. It'd be nice to be heard a little bit more in the Northwest. It'd be nice to be heard and have a little bit more of an impact. This sense of frustration with just not being heard and listened to is very widespread. But actually, it's not just isolated to you know, any one part of the country. It's a feeling that's actually true across the country. So we asked a question here, people in the north and south are able to make their voices heard. Only 35% of people think that is the case. And obviously significantly lower numbers in the north, most particularly in the northeast, are only 19%. So it's almost half what the national average is there. And if you look at those numbers there in terms of the breakdown, progressive activists, so it was interesting in that in the survey, it's unsurprising the kind of community, people who are involved in community building, in advocacy, in activism do tend to be quite concentrated among the progressive activists. So not surprising, I'm a little bit surprising that we had 100% in the sample here, but that is, it's a group that is very much the sort of the core of a lot of the non-profit work in the country, and also has the lowest confidence of all the groups that people can make their voices heard. Here's another question, sort of similar question. People in London aren't aware of what it's like to live in the rest of the country. They live in a bubble. So this is trying to get not just the question about your view of Westminster and government, but actually just more like, is there a sense of tension among people? And there's really strong agreement with that. 80%, 4 out of 5 people believe that. And highest numbers there, the loyal nationals who really feel excluded by that kind of metropolitan elites who look down on them. But higher numbers there, 9 out of 10 in the north. So that sort of sense of fatigue and frustration about sort of a London-centered country is very strong here in the north. But it's also worth noting, even in London, 60% of people think that people in London aren't aware of what it's like to live in the rest of the country and live in a bubble. So it's not really a London versus the rest of the country question. Too much in our country is decided in London. Again, it's sort of similar picture, 4 out of 5 people across the country, but even higher numbers, about even more than 9 out of 10 across the north. When we ask a question about your experience of, is the area where you live, does it feel neglected? The numbers here are really high in the north, very distinctly higher than the rest of the country. So 51% of people nationally, 84% in the northeast, 68% northwest, 67% Yorkshire. Notice that again, there's a difference in people's experience, and I mentioned the established Liberals as a smaller number in the north. They're that most sort of status quo, comfortable group. They have a much lower sense of neglect, only 33%, but it's pretty high there among all of the other segments of the population, and highest among the loyal nationals, who have this very strong sense of group, and that they feel that their group is being neglected, that they're part of a group that is sort of under threat. Looking to what we learn about common ground across the country as our last thing. Here's Ben, an established Liberal from Leeds. I do think we're incredibly supportive of each other as a society as a whole. I don't think it's true in other countries. I haven't got any first-hand experience of being a different nationality, but I do think we have this amazing British spirit that is coming through at the moment. So that's one part of our community, the established Liberal view that is much more positive and benign. And I think a sentiment that is very different to what a progressive activist will feel, for example. And it's important to, as I say, you know, there are voices that are across the whole spectrum of the community. Established Liberals, 12% of the population overall. But what is our commonality? What is our common ground? What's striking to us that we discuss at some length in the report is the extent to which there is common ground among many issues. Now, there are some things where there are differences, if you're a little bit more on the left, a little bit more on the right, but in terms of faith in the NHS or pride in the NHS, overwhelmingly the number one thing for the whole country. 57% of people cited it as one of the top 3 things that gave them pride in the country. Countryside and nature is also very widely cited, and that's across the whole country, across all of our segments. And there's great pride in voluntary work. That's rated as the 3rd of the most commonly cited sources of pride. Then there's history and the armed forces. That's a little bit more strongly among the traditionalists, among the backbone conservatives, among the loyal nationals, and the established Liberals, a little bit less among the progressive activists, civic pragmatists, for example. So there are some issues on which there's difference like that, but the overall picture is a really significant commonality on some of those sources of pride. And that's when you look at that regionally, the story is in the north, it's not really that different to the rest of the country. There are some sort of smaller nuances. Yorkshire and the Humber, a higher level of pride in countryside and nature, for example, beautiful region, but pretty similar numbers otherwise across the north. There's also a real sense of pride in diversity. And this is interesting because this is an area where there's been a lot of cultural change in the last few decades in the UK as in other Western countries. I'm proud that we're more embracing of people of diverse religions, races and sexual orientation than before. The numbers there, overall 70% of people express pride in that, and pretty much bang on average in the north. And you can see there's different levels of pride, much more strongly among progressive activists, civic pragmatists, but even among the loyal nationals, the disengaged traditionalist backbone conservatives, that majority of them feel a sense of pride in us becoming a more diverse country. It's even more true on gender. This is something that really does unite the country, a sense of pride in the advancements around equality between men and women. You know, it is not something that divides the country. It is 4 out of 5 people. And again, in terms of numbers, the north, very similar to the average, slightly lower in the northwest, slightly higher in Yorkshire and the Humber. There is a real sense of commonality as well about seeing inequality as a serious problem in the UK, 3/4 of the country, and very similar numbers nationally. So that is also a source of common ground. We asked a lot of questions about class, your sense of class awareness, and one of the interesting things, and we also looked at the social grades, so the A, B, C1, C2, etc. And a key finding here is that actually on all the issues that divide our country now, there's very little difference between people on the basis of class, but there is significant difference on the basis of values. But inequality is an interesting angle here, because inequality, rather than class in a sense being a source of division, the issue of inequality is now actually a source of unity and common ground across the country. So no wonder you have a Conservative government speaking about the levelling up agenda, for example, 4 out of 5 people concerned about those issues. There's also really strong awareness of racism. 77% of people say that it is a serious problem, and similar numbers, slightly lower in the northeast than in the other parts of the north. Protecting the environment, building a society that is based on, it can help to build a society that's based on not selfishness, community, and not division. That's a sense that 3 and 4 people share. And again, similar numbers across the north. So what's one of the things that we found striking was how much the sort of return to nature experience during lockdown, the cleaner air, etc., has actually made people more aware of the environment. And also they see it as that action on climate, for example, can actually create jobs in their community. They don't see it as a sort of a choice between being green and protecting jobs. And that's a particularly positive shift. So it's 3 out of 4 people. And again, relatively similar numbers, slightly lower in the northwest than the rest of the country. All right, so we'll stop there. I know that's a ton of information to convey, but we'd love to now open it up for discussion in a moment, but I think I'm handing it back to, is it Stephanie? Is it for you to discuss the...
Thanks, Tim. Thanks very much, Andarissa, for that. It was absolutely brilliant. I mean, obviously, you guys know that I'm a massive fan of the work, and I think the level of detail and understanding of those different groups is absolutely amazing. And I'm sure that everybody that's come along today has really, really found that very, very interesting and insightful. We were going to go on to look at the People's Powerhouse recovery information, but I wonder whether it might be best to take some questions now while they're fresh in people's minds, rather than going on to a different subject and then coming back to this, and then we can wrap up with that at the end instead. So yeah, I guess it's open to questions. You can either post them in the chat, and I know there's been a few. There's one from Ruth that we could maybe go to first, or maybe if you post them in the chat or signal to me by switching your video on or putting your hand up that you've got a question, that would be great. But to kick us off, Ruth, you had a question around the issue of pride. What makes people proud?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? I'm on a funny microphone. Yeah, it was just, I was really interested in that because it was evidently a sort of a checkbox selection. Did people rank those things in order, or were they picking one? How did that question work?
So they were allowed to pick up to 3. There was a long, they were allowed to pick up to 3.
Yeah, okay. I was just really, it's impossible to find this out, of course, but I was just curious as to what people might have nominated as the things that make them most proud if they hadn't been prompted with a list, and whether the NHS would have come out on top still in a poll at that point in time, when everyone's minds was on COVID and the NHS's response, and we're all clapping on doorsteps. And I wonder whether the NHS factor there is perhaps a bit skewed in taking a poll of that nature at that particular point in time. It's a very minor point. It's just something that really interests me, because I always think there's a difference if you prompt people or if you let them just answer with their own thoughts. And I wonder if maybe there are some more answers lower down the list that didn't make it onto the chart that people had entered as a free choice sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that question we actually asked before COVID. So
okay.
that, that is a reflection of just how significant NHS is even before this year. We did ask, and there is a list, I think there's about maybe a dozen items in the list, but we also did allow people just to enter their own. So one thing that we didn't have was the British sense of humour, and that a few people cited that. Other than that, I would say, we got probably, I don't know, maybe a couple of hundred free text responses of additional things, but there wasn't any consistent theme. You often get just kind of quite random comments being made when you give the free text thing, but yeah, I think that we, to compose that list of the options, we went through a range of literature to see all the evidence about what did give people a sense of pride. So I don't think that anything significant was missed out from that. As I say, we didn't get anything. I would put sense of humour in there, and maybe there might be one or two other small things, but I think it was reasonably representative.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And we've got a question from Johnny. I don't know if you want to just unmute yourself, Johnny.
Yeah, hi guys. That was brilliant. That was really good. My question is, if you were going to pick sort of 2 or 3 main policies that could unite a big majority of people, what would they be?
I think the clear ones that come out are around inequality, because that, when you've got such a, in every segment and across every part of the country, super majorities of people saying there's something wrong in how our system works. We asked the question, do you see it as a rigged system? Do you think the UK has a rigged system where the rules are all set by the rich and influential? And 2/3 of the country believe that. So, I think that there's always, of course, an awareness of inequality, and that, the understanding of social class came from this country. But I think that it's just stronger now. And the fact that only 1 in 7 people think that work is adequately rewarded, I think that's really striking. I think that one of the lessons, particularly for those of us who are more on the progressive side, is to understand that talking about that purely in terms of inequality misses a point. A lot of what people more among the disengaged traditionalists, loyal nationals, backbone conservatives, a lot of what they see is people work hard and don't get rewarded, and that's their sense of injustice. And they have a very strong sense of fairness. People follow the rules, but then the system doesn't look after them. And I think that the unifying way to approach the issue of inequality is to talk about not just inequality and the gap between the haves and the have-nots, that we actually think is the much better language to use. People use that more regularly, but it's people, I think across the country, people feel that if you can't work, then you should be looked after. We should be a caring society, but they feel like, yeah, but the rules are such that if you work hard, you should, if you can work, you should work. So it's more the conservative value, but then also if you do work, you should be rewarded. And so that kind of rewarding hard work and closing the gap between the haves and have-nots, that is unifying. I think local communities, strengthening local communities is really strong because of that sense of frustration with centralised government. I think that's even stronger this year after all the failings around the pandemic response. So I think that localization is really strong. People want they're thinking more about community than they did before COVID, and they've seen some positive things in their community. Their most positive experiences in the pandemic period have been more localized. I think the environmental piece is really important because, you know, we've shown this research that this is not a left versus right issue. There are slightly different ways people on the right will talk about the environment. They'll talk more about nature and conserving nature or protecting nature and our natural heritage. And so you should be aware, if you want to build a broad platform on protecting the environment, it shouldn't always be climate, 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 and it shouldn't always be in the language of activism. But the general point, and even the point also about the UK being a leader internationally on climate policy or on the environment, you know, there's a real sense of agreement around that. So I think in that sense, you know, there's more. What strikes me, because we've done this work in other countries, and why I'm in some ways more optimistic about the UK than a lot of other countries, is the common ground is really significant here. There's just more common ground on these issues and more of a sense that we really need to fix these things than there is in most other Western democracies. The risk, the danger is that if we don't make those changes, then people's frustration with politics could become more intense, and their willingness to go for more extreme alternatives, populist alternatives, etc., might actually be greater in the future. I'm not like next year or the year after, but I think in this decade, if we do not make progress on these things where 3/4 of the country want to see things change, then I think that is dangerous for the democracy. Democracy needs to deliver. I actually think at a political level, what we need is people are incredibly exhausted with the conflict of the Brexit years, and that sense of exhaustion and frustration with conflict is also a unifying message. People want to see politicians actually get stuff done. They don't want to see people always playing politics. One of the temptations, I'll talk to you, because many people, you know, in this in our community, maybe more on the progressive side, it's really important to not look at everything through a political lens. The thing that you learn about progressive activists from a lot of the focus group conversations and the quantitative research is, yeah, when you have a very strong political identity, you interpret everything politically. You don't want a conservative government to do anything good because, you know, politics is so important to your identity. And the problem with that is that, you know, if we get into a situation where, as a country, only people on the left want to, you know, people on the left only want to see progress under a Labor government, people on the right only want to see progress under a Conservative government, that undermines faith in democracy as a whole. We have to look at ways in which, and this is, you know, what we've been talking about with politicians with this report, demonstrate that politicians can actually work together to get stuff done. Dealing with the gap between the haves and have-not is not something that you can really achieve in one term of government. Also, environmental policy is multi-term. So showing that there are some points on which politicians can actually go with common ground, maybe follow the direction from the community, and even just making the effort rather than playing everything I win, you lose sort of politics. There is such an appetite to do that differently. And the last thing just to say about that in terms of what this agenda is, you know, to go back to our segments, only 2 of the 7 segments see the world through the lens of politics and have a very strong political identity. 5 out of 7 groups, and the vast majority of the country, 3/4 of the country, primarily look at their country through the lens of the society and community and just want to see politics work. And I think that if politicians and if government, you know, at every level could respond more to that sentiment and listen less to the Twitter conflict that's going on all the time, people would be much happier with their democracy.
Brilliant, thanks. And thanks for that question, Johnny. And thanks for that answer, Tim. I think that's probably been the biggest eye-opener for me, looking at this report and looking at myself. I obviously come up as a progressive activist, as do 100% of the people on this call. And I think that's something for us to look at as progressive activists, as how much of a bubble do we exist in as well? And how much of our expectation about how people think about politics is actually reflected in reality. And how do we change the way that we communicate with the public en masse and our own work, really, to reflect actually what the public wants and perhaps a little bit less of what we want. So I've got a follow-on question. I know we've got a question from Carl, but I've got a follow-on question from Alison, so it might be worth just doing Alison's question first, and then we'll come on to Carl. We've also got a question from John. So yeah, Alison, if you don't mind.
Hi. Well, I think you've probably, and we talked about it, because I keep having conversations about at the moment about getting out of our bubble, and it just made me laugh that here we are again. You know, here we are in the bubble, all of us. So we're having a conversation about universal basic income. I went to a meeting last night on proportional representation. There's this frustration that we can't move out of these circles that we move in. And so it's just it's not an easy question to answer, but this is so interesting and it's so valuable. And to start thinking how we can use this to, as exactly as you say, Stephanie, start to talk to people and understand where they're coming from, rather than just, this is absolutely how it should be. This is what I believe, and you should believe this, and this is how it should be. So thank you very much. It's incredibly interesting.
Great, thanks for that, Alison. Is there anything you want to add to that, Tim, or shall we move on to the next question? Great. We've got a question from Carl. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your name right. I know Arissa has answered it in the chat, but it might just be worth asking, just for the benefit of everybody else in the room, just very quickly, if that's okay.
That's fine. Sorry, everybody. My camera is not working at the moment, so apologies for that. My question was about when we talk about diversity. I mean, I was going through the kind of categories that have been put up there, and I still didn't manage to complete it, purely because the first question that was asked was about British values, and not everybody understands what British values are. So the question on diversity was, for all intents and purposes, how are you able to check that and check and balance it?
Sorry, just to clarify, how are we able to check and balance how people interpret the questions? Do you mean?
People interpreting the question is one thing, but the backgrounds of those particular people in terms of diversity, because diversity for me isn't just about, for all intents and purposes, skin colour, gender, it's also thought. So I was interested in terms of how you, for all intents and purposes, gauged who, if you could, were participating in the actual survey.
Yeah. Well, the survey overall, I guess it's a standard kind of professional research firm. We did this with YouGov. It's weighted according to distribution of the population on, Arissa, you can probably help me on this, the number of different things. I think it's sort of age, income, region, education, BAME, what else?
You've caught most of them.
I mean, I think that, so you've got, it's a very large sample as well. So it's over 10,000 and over sort of multiple waves of research. I think that, I think that you're right. One of the questions that we've been dealing with the research firms, and I think it was shown up in the US election, is that there's a group of people in the community, significant group. I mean, we talk about the disengaged groups, the disengaged battlers, the disengaged traditionalists. It's that is less likely to participate in survey responses. And that's one of the reasons why, the polling research undercounts the Trump voters. But you would have to say here, you're not talking about, I mean, it's a big, 5% is a big undercount, right? When you're talking about a national election, it's whether you win or lose an election. But these very large samples, because of they've got teams constantly trying to adjust and be as representative as possible, you are getting a pretty good cross section. I mean, I absolutely agree that there's a few percentage points here or there, but I don't think that there's any evidence that there's a whole sort of category of person in terms of the values that doesn't participate, at all in this sort of research. Maybe the undercount on different, maybe it's 5 or 10%, for example, but they work pretty hard to address that. And I think that, the level of, I mean, even in our focus groups, when we talk to the disengaged groups, behaviorally, they're often different from the rest of the community. You are capturing that group that sort of, is just, I mean, sometimes you have to give more incentives for them to participate, for example, but you are capturing, I think, a pretty good cross section. But I agree with your point. I mean, the larger point, I guess, with all of our research is we're saying, look at people's values, beliefs, their disposition to each other, their disposition to society. That is the biggest source of difference among us in many respects, where, we've tended to historically think of, it's left or right, or then we think through the demographic categories. And what our research across different countries shows is that Now on the identity issues, identity and belonging and community issues that are, often the fractures in our societies, just looking at people through that lens of the demographics is missing a lot of the drivers of why people are responding, voting for different people, behaving politically in different ways. And so we're trying to capture that with our work.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from John Edwards.
There you go. Sorry, didn't know where the mute button was. Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, a bit nervous about talking now, but I'm increasingly getting interested in social value as part of central government contracts. And of all of the different themes that are identified by government, it strikes me that community integration is kind of right there at the very bottom of the different themes that are identified in terms of COVID-19 recovery, economic inequality. It's more about jobs. But from your research, it strikes me that community integration and community improvement on a local level is actually stuff that people would respond to on a much more positively in almost every category. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think it's disconnected from the other issues. So, in an ideal world, I think that, I think there's a strong argument for looking at specific policies that can build people's sense of agency and contribution and working together at a local level. So participatory budgeting, that idea that a community, even if it's quite small amounts of money, but communities make their own choices about how they invest funds, just as a practical policy mechanism, it creates a reason for people to collaborate at that local community level, and feeling that you're involved and your voice is heard is really, really important in shifting people from disengagement and distrust, which makes people more vulnerable to the us versus them, the division. Shifting people that way is really important. I mean, it's also really important from the jobs perspective, because all of your deeper research in, the reasons for marginalization and exclusion show that, poverty and joblessness is in many ways is much more acute when you don't have the social networks and the social connection. So the more that we strengthen community and connection, the more we can help people who have been marginalized for whatever different reasons to be more integrated with society and also to find their way back into the workforce. And, some of that is just like, it's very human. So I do think there's a sense in which there's an intersection among, like, in the community building approach and strengthening neighborliness and people's sense of sort of common good in their community actually does complement an economic agenda. Purely looking at that as if it's sort of just about businesses kind of misses the point. And that's especially true as when we get beyond the crisis management of this moment. And I'm an economist by background, so I figure this sort of partly through that lens. The long run is, stronger community equals stronger economy. And also, if you think of climate comes in here, because changes in our transport systems and changes in our electricity production, localization, energy generation with renewables, whatever, creates local jobs, but also answers some of those big questions. So one of the positive things I think about where we are in the next decade and beyond is actually a lot of the things that we need to deal with are converging rather than forcing us into opposing decisions. The one big vulnerability we clearly have is, is our capacity to make those investments when we end up with, such a large amount of debt, which is inevitable because of the pandemic. So that also means we need to be making the right choices now. Okay.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's good to hear you bring PB into it as well. It's certainly something close to my heart. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure we've got any more questions now. So that was absolutely brilliant. And I just want to say a massive thank you again to Tim and Arissa for coming along and sharing their research. I'm sure you'll all agree that it's absolutely fascinating and quite a fresh insight into the way in which Britain ticks, I guess, really. And I think particularly for people that are politically minded, to have your eyes open to the fact that there are a vast majority of the population that don't actually think and believe, kind of think like you, but also the fact that the most important part of the research is the fact that actually there's more in common than there is that actually is different, and it's about us finding ways to draw out that commonality. So before I say goodbye, I'm going to show a short video just shortly to see us out, which is around some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. But I just wanted to give either Tim or Arissa an opportunity to just say a few final words if they wanted to.
I don't want to jump in over Arissa, who is sitting in lockdown in at hotel quarantine in Thailand and doing an amazing job at all hours. Arissa?
Just going to say thank you so much for having us. It's obviously been so wonderful to partner with you, and it's so great to meet you all today. And thank you for your very interesting, insightful questions.
And thank you very much. And we're really looking forward to collaborating, supporting People's Powerhouse work in the future. You know, we do this research I mentioned at the beginning. The other part of our work is really programmatic. So it's applying insights from the research and finding ways to really make an impact to bridge divisions and to strengthen community. And that's the next phase for our work in the UK. Now that we've done this big study, is that over the next year and beyond, we'll be working out building out programmatic work. So I'm sure that we'll have opportunities to collaborate. But thank you, and thanks to everybody who's in the community, the People's Powerhouse community, as community builders. It's been such a tough year, but it's also, I think, one of the positive things about from the research is that it's not all been lost. There are some real gains that we can build on in people's sense of valuing each other, valuing community, valuing care. And so even though everybody feels so fatigued and exhausted and frustrated by many things, we can go into Christmas feeling like there is actually real evidence there that there have been some positive shifts in how we see each other.
Thank you very much. And that very seamlessly kind of moves us on to just the last little part of our event this afternoon. So as obviously the research has shown, and as Tim just alluded to then, obviously it's about how do you actually start to make some of these changes. And we know from the presentation this afternoon that we've heard that there is a high majority of people, not only in the north, but higher in the north, that feel like they're not getting their voice heard. And I think that's, a general feeling, but also our feeling is that in particular around COVID, there has been a distinct lack of public voice and very little actually that we've managed to hear from the kind of human experience of COVID. A lot of it's been around statistics and the science, which is obviously is important, but as humans, we want to be able to connect with other humans as well. And we think that there has not been enough opportunity for people to influence some of the decision making around COVID. And the reason, so because of that, we earlier on this year, in around about April, May time, we launched a coalition. We brought together 150 organisations from across the north to do just that. We wanted to find out what people in communities thought they wanted their communities to look like post-COVID, to give people the opportunity to just talk about their hopes and their ideas and what's not working and what they would like to see in the future. And for about over 3 months over the summer, we held a survey, we did a number of focus groups, worked with a lot of organisations that are here today. And from that, what's been highlighted is 7 principles for recovery. So what we would say, people-led recovery. What is it that people want to see their communities look like? What is it that people want to see policy be concentrated on? Where do they want money to be spent? And what we've done is we've put together a short video, just 5 minutes long, of the people, some of the voices of the people that were involved in the work. So they're just normal everyday people that live in the north, basically telling us what it is that they want to see prioritised in the future. So I just want to say a massive thank you again to everyone's coming. Massive thank you to Tim and Arissa. And I'm going to play the video, and then when that ends, you can go off and get some lunch. Obviously, I'm Steph, I'm from the People's Powerhouse. I'll pop my email address in the chat there. So if anybody doesn't know who we are and have come to this event and this is the first time you've experienced the People's Powerhouse, I'd absolutely love you to get in touch. So I'm now going to do some hopefully seamless screen sharing. Okay, 1 minute. That's worked. Sorry, 1 second. I'm afraid I'm having some problems. It's not letting me tick the button. So I think rather than you watching me kind of faff about with buttons, what I'll do is the video's up on YouTube. So when we send out some information after the event, I'll make sure that we include that as well. So thanks once again, everybody.